I want to tell you all about a very exciting development for Environmental Health Trust. Governor Mark Gordon, who is likely to be our next governor again, wrote this letter recently to the Federal Communications Commission. And he wrote it in response to a lawsuit that had been filed by Environmental Health Trust, where the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia ruled that there was substantial evidence in the record that the Federal Communications Commission had not taken into account in their decision to tell people that their 25-year-old standards were still valid, which is a decision that we obviously object to. Before discussing that, though, I want to give a little commercial message here for looking at effects in dads as well as moms. Dr. Taylor is an expert in pregnancy and its outcomes. But one of the things that's important to remember is it takes two to tango. And 50% of the genome comes from the male. Without doubt, many of the damaging effects can occur during pregnancy, but some can occur prior to it as a result of the sperm exposure. And in particular, infertility problems have been increasing. And among the things we know increase infertility problems in men are the things listed here: alcohol, drugs, pesticides, metals, tobacco. All of these things have been shown, both experimentally and in studies of humans, to increase problems of reproduction. Now, Dr. Taylor will talk to you more about the importance of experimental findings and human findings, because he does both. I've spent, unfortunately, more time than I ever imagined working on this issue, and in 2010 wrote a book that we are going to be reissuing later this year. But the most important thing to tell you is that government limits are 26 years old. The current standards for every one of the world's 8 billion phones and many more devices are 26 years old. And the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals was so appalled by that, that when our organization sued and asked for an update of the standards, the court ruled that we had established the failure of the FCC to provide a record of reasoned decision-making. An agency is free to look at the record and disagree with what's submitted, but they have to give reasons. They can't just say, never mind. We happen to know that that's exactly what happened in the final decision when the rule was issued just before December of 2019. And the court ordered that the FCC had got to address the impacts of radiation in children. And we've heard, I think, from the talks today so far why that's so important. The court also held that there was a failure to consider any of the evidence on environmental effects. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about in a moment today. But I want to add one new finding from your colleagues at Yale, which is a study funded by the American Cancer Society, published just 2 years ago, looked at specific genetic mutations called SNP, single nucleotide excision repair, and found that people that had a fairly common SNP had a very high rate of thyroid cancer associated with cell phone use. And this was a rather robust study published in a very important journal, and yet we hear very little public discussion about this issue. Where is the thyroid? Here. You heard about acoustic aroma? Here. The brain tumors we're concerned about? Here. They're all right within the flow of cell phone radiation. Now, we are concerned about the deployment of 5G, and this community should be especially concerned because it ain't here yet, but it's coming. And in order for 5G to work, you need a 5G phone, a 5G router, a 5G computer. All their devices have to be new. 5G becomes a very effective marketing scheme. And yet in many countries where they have tried to introduce it, there's been a large failure to launch, if you will. What I can tell you is that these studies that I'm showing you here have modeled how much more radiation exposure there would be if 5G existed at the current permitted levels. So you see on the left of the image in front of you what you have currently in simulated for Austin, Texas. And then on the right, you see what would be permitted with 5G. And by the way, that's what is now permitted in the town of Jackson. 5G only works ideally in an urban setting anyhow, because you need an antenna every 100 yards or so. And they have to be able to talk to one another and form beams. So a study was done in South Carolina, published this year, and they looked at the actual measurements found in certain areas in the town. And one of our projects in the coming year will be to measure radiation at distances that they're supposed to be a certain levels set by the FCC. And when those levels are in fact measured, and this is one example of it, antennas are found much closer to ground than they're supposed to be. They're put on things that look like street lamps, but they're not. All of those lovely street lamps that you see going into Jackson are in fact cameras, which is not a bad thing because you can tell if somebody's here who's up to no good, but they all can become 5G antennas very, very easily. And what we don't want to see happening is this exposure to take place without a full assessment of the environmental impacts that this radiation can have. Here is an example that you might not have thought of. This is a study of how radio frequency radiation can damage trees. Now, trees have the advantage, like the zebrafish and the mouse and the rat, that they don't listen to the news and they can't be biased by reports. And so you look at this study and you don't need to be a rocket scientist to see clear evidence that the side of the tree closest to the tower there is dying. And it will take this tree another 10 years till the whole tree eventually is sicker and may not survive. And this is a statistical analysis that was published looking at radiation damage to trees by visual inspection and then putting a grid over it so that you count the number of leaves on one side versus another. And this is a Norway maple, and there are other trees that have been shown also to be damaged, similarly damaged significantly by their proximity to towers. This is a very important study that was done where they made a model of the honeybee, a three-dimensional model of the honeybee. Now, honeybees and pollinating insects are critically important for agriculture. There are over 2,000 different pollinators. It's not just the honeybee. And we see the hummingbirds are pollinators, where they're about to fly the coop now, so they're all drinking a lot of our sugar water. But hummingbirds, bees, a number of animals, all invertebrates, are pollinators, and this study modeled the honeybee body. And you can see that the 2 gigahertz, which would have been the old radiation exposure, it goes through. The color of red indicates highest exposure. But at 24 gigahertz, which is what 5G can be, it doesn't exist yet, but it can be, it goes entirely through and literally lights up the body of the bee. And that's an experimental study that has been done. Other studies have shown that there's reduced motor activity in worker bees. There's something called a piping signal that they do in order to tell one another to get to work and what they're supposed to do. And the worker bees and the bees that are supposed to be the defender bees, all of them show problematic behavior with exposure to this radiation in experimental studies that have been done where you take beehives and you put a phone in the hive, you put another hive with a phone in it, and it's not operating, and you turn on the phone in the one, you don't turn it on in the other, and then you have a control hive with nothing. And significant evidence occurs. Ultimately, the queens stop doing their job, which is to make lots and lots of eggs, to make more bees, to make more honey. And there have been a number of studies showing this, not just one. Our website has information on this. Now, the New Hampshire Commission on 5G specifically looked at the issue of wildlife, recently examining all the data that the FCC did not examine. As they had a commission that Theodora will tell you about in a moment that had 13 different members who were experts in electrical engineering, professors, and specialists in their field. they looked at all of the evidence. It was one of the first times to do that. And we were honored that Theodora Scorato, our executive director, and I testified before that commission. And they took seriously all the information that was provided, and they concluded that safety limits need to be developed for wildlife. And I would urge all of you here in Jackson to see that that happens, because we are not protecting our animals if we are radiating them and interfering with cryptochromes, which is the hidden protein behind the eye in every migrating animal ever studied, whether a bird or a bee or a fruit fly. They all have cryptochromes that are sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field that can be interfered with by this radiation. Now, where are we on this issue? Remember this? This was an ad from the Journal of the American Medical Association. Dr. Mo Melian, our distinguished chairman, is here, and he trained in medicine long enough ago that he can remember when surgeons' conventions were full of smoke, and most doctors smoked. It's a high-stress job, right? And so these ads were boasting how tobacco was safe and refreshing and invigorating, right?
They died about the age of 45.
And yes, he's adding that they died at about the age of 45 because some of them were so heavy, such heavy smokers. In my secret history book, I talk about the fact that the tobacco industry funded the National Cancer Institute to $11 million to make a safe cigarette in the 1970s. In the 1970s, and the head of the National Cancer Institute was a 4-pack-a-day smoker. So we've come a long way from the time when we believed that tobacco was good for you. And I think, unfortunately, we need to take a step back from our enthusiasm with the blessings of the technology, which are real and important and undeniable when it comes to things like emergency response, and when it comes to the ability to develop commerce in developing countries. There are real advantages, but we have to also take a question as to what are we doing to ourselves, our children, and the planet. Probably the most important thing I did, I was involved as a young scientist in the committee that actually reviewed the data and recommended that there be no smoking on airplanes. You may be shocked to hear that it was even a question for science at the time, but it was. And when I look at what we know now about mobile phone radiation, I see some very interesting similarities.
A growing number of prominent doctors and scientists are raising warning flags over radiation this morning, and your kids could be facing a greater risk of exposure.
I think the most important study is a study by the National Toxicology Program in a classic large carcinogenicity test, one of the largest ever performed, and for that matter, one of the most expensive. They found increased risk of the tumors which we believe radiofrequency radiation is causing in man. Particular tumors called schwannomas. In the rats, they were in the heart. In humans, they're often in the nerve, the ear nerve, the vestibular nerve.
Cell phone providers say they follow all safety guidelines put into place by the FCC.
The current FCC safety standard was developed nearly 20 years ago.
The manufacturers actually tell people in the instruction manual, which I've never read, not to put the cell phone against your ear.
It does say exactly that. There's the BlackBerry, for example, warns to keep your phone at least 0.98 inches away from the body when transmitting. With an iPhone, for example, it's 5/8 of an inch.
At this point, the evidence has become sufficiently strong that cell phone radiation is a human carcinogen.
A major development from California's Department of Public Health. High use of cell phones may be linked to certain types of cancer and other health effects, including brain cancer and tumors, lower sperm counts, headaches, and effects on learning, memory, hearing, behavior, and sleep.
If it was a real problem, I would know. If it was a real problem, the government would protect us. How come I'm not hearing about this? They're all things I've heard when I give seminars. You know, I get up there and they say, oh yeah, if this was really a problem, they would have told us. I am they. I am a, legitimate scientist, and I am telling you.